Hi, my name is Becky Neiman. I'm the daughter of Dr. David Neiman and producer of this body of work. I'm starting a new series where I interview people who are in fields related to the subjects my father discussed. And my first guest is a fascinating woman named Frankie Snyder. Frankie?
Hi, so nice to be with you today.
So I discovered you when I saw you in a video. And what I heard then is that you were walking by something called the Sifting Project, and
Yes.
that you saw what was going on and you volunteered to help. And you ended up doing something very interesting. And I saw it, let's see, it was called the opus sectile floor for the exhibit of Herod the Great, the King's Final Journey. And I was really fascinated with how this came about. So why don't you tell me about how you got involved with the Sifting Project and what the Sifting Project is?
Okay. I first moved to Israel in 2007. I made Aliyah. I went there. I didn't have any plans for getting a job or anything. I was going to take some Hebrew classes, eventually take a course to be a tour guide. And in the meantime, I would just volunteer at whatever I could find around town. Well, very shortly after I got to Israel, maybe 2 weeks later, I heard about the Temple Mount Sifting Project. This is a project where the directors were going through material that had been tossed off the Temple Mount by the Muslims when they were creating an entryway to go into a mosque that they had created on the Temple Mount. And in this material, they were finding all different kinds of things. So I made a trip out to the Sifting Project one day, just as a regular tourist. And I just wanted to see what they were doing and if I'd be interested in volunteering out there. It was easy to get to. I could hop on the local bus and be there within an hour, crossing town. So I went there and I really liked the idea of what they were doing, recovering all these materials that showed the past 3,000 years of history from the Temple Mount. So I started volunteering there, and after 2 weeks, I was hired. Now, at this point, I'd only been in the country for a month. I didn't speak the language, but I got hired. So it's like, that's good. You can stay here. You've got something to do. You've got income now. One of the things that we were finding were these geometric shaped tiles. They're polished on the top, very beautifully carved into all different kinds of geometric shapes. And as we were collecting them, I asked one of the archaeologists one day, what are you doing with these? Are you trying to figure out how to put the patterns back together again? And the archaeologist said, no, right now we're collecting them, we're cataloging them, we're storing them. But if you're interested in doing something like that, give it a try. And I said, well, yeah, I've got a math degree. I'm very interested in geometry. But yeah, I'll try this. Well, that was the beginning of a 14-year career in Israel.
When I first saw you, I thought, well, is this woman involved in ceramics? Is she an artist? And you said, I'm a mathematician. I was like, wow.
I'm a mathematician, but I also had my master's degree in Jewish studies. So I had a good background in Jewish history. And I knew all about King Herod. And one of the things they were finding in these tiles were ones that they thought were from the Herodian period, ones that King Herod may have used on the Temple Mount when he was expanding the Temple Mount and beautifying the place. So I began to look through all these tiles, began to catalog them, and began to look at pictures and going to sites that had these opus sectile tiles. And it was not only Herodian sites, but Byzantine churches, Crusader floors, Islamic buildings, modern buildings. And I began to realize that within the tiles that we had on the Temple Mount, we actually had a 2,000-year range of tiles. So I began to study and find out what kind of materials were used at one time, and another, what shapes, what sizes, what measurements they were using. Like some of them are cut according to the Roman foot. Others are cut according to the foot that we use today. Other ones are cut according to inches. Some of them are cut according to centimeters. So by knowing how they were cutting the tiles, I could put it into a time category.
And how did you find out these dimensions?
By measuring a lot of tiles,
okay.
On sites where I knew where the tiles came from. I could sit there and I could measure them, and you begin to come up with certain numbers. And I could then begin to sort out the Herodian tiles, which were based on the Roman foot, from the other tiles. I visited several of the Herodian palaces that used these tiles. Masada was particularly helpful because there were still 3 rooms and a bathhouse that had tiles in situ on the floor. So I could see the tile impressions in some places, and other places the actual tiles, and I could actually measure them and begin to figure out what Herod was doing with all of his tiles. Meanwhile, this project for the Israel Museum was getting started. That was back around 2010. And the day that the archaeologists, or rather the curators from the Israel Museum, went out to Herodium to designate many of the architectural elements that were part of Herod's burial mausoleum, there was a very unfortunate accident. Ehud Netzer, who had been the archaeologist there since the 1970s, fell backwards and hit his head and passed away 3 days later. So in the midst of trying to put together this entire exhibit at the museum, suddenly the leader was gone. So they had to start asking other people to work on various projects. And one of the things they had were all these opus sectile tiles from Herodium and Kypros. And they wanted a floor put together for the exhibit. So they had heard that somebody out at the Sifting project is working with these tiles. So I was contacted and asked if I could put together a floor for the museum. So here I was. I'd been in the country less than 5 years. I was not an archaeologist, and I had an exhibit at the Israel Museum, which was absolutely phenomenal. But because of this floor, many of the archaeologists around the country who had these kind of tiles realized, hey, there's somebody in town right now who's actually starting to work with these tiles. So within a year, I had been contacted by 8 different Herodian palaces to help analyze the tiles that they had found at their palaces. So that was my real beginning, was the fortunate thing of being able to create this floor for the museum. But unfortunately, it was because of the death of Ehud Netzer that I even got brought into the project.
And you say there are 8 Herodian
There
temples? What are they?
There are a lot of Herodian palaces, 8 of which have these kind of tiles within them. There's another, I don't know, 10, 15 other palaces around that don't use these kind of floors. They usually use mosaics, what would have been found there. But at 8 of the palaces, there are these floors. And I have been working now with all 8 of the palaces and publishing articles for each of them about the tiles that they have.
I read that you were involved with something in Banyas. That
Yes.
You were discovering or proving that there was a palace there.
Yes, back in the late 1800s, a particular type of wall was discovered up on the side of the ridgeline above the grotto at Banyas. And it's something called an opus reticulanum wall. It's a particular type of Roman construction that's made with little square stones that are laid. It's sort of in a chessboard, in a checkerboard kind of pattern, but at a diagonal. And Ehud Netzer was very interested in these because he realized there were only 2 other places in the country that had an opus reticulanum wall. And they were both Herodian structures. So he was pretty sure this was Herodian. So he and a small crew went up there for 1 week in the summer of 1977 and 1 week in the summer of 1978 and excavated just small portions of the site. And one of the things they found were about 175 opus sectile tiles. And they packed them away neatly and put them in a box, and they were being stored at the university. Once I started doing the work for the museum, the archaeologist who was then in charge of that, she inherited it because of Netzer's death. Her name was Raquel Barnatan. Raquel asked me if I could analyze the tiles that they had. Well, once I started working with them, looking at the sizes and the shapes, I could only really come up with one pattern to put them together. And it was something as sort of an 8-pointed star pattern that was popular in the Roman period. Usually it was used as a single block pattern, but here it was repeated over and over again to cover a floor. And I noticed that it was very similar to a floor pattern at Jericho and contained the same variety of imported marble stones. So I'm looking at this and going, guys, we have a palace here.
Mhm.
This seems to be another triclinium, similar to what was built at Jericho. And Netzer had noticed several similarities between Jericho and Banyas, but this was sort of like the icing on the cake when we found these beautiful floor tiles, and the floors were so similar to one another. And we came to the conclusion this is a historically unrecorded palace of King Herod the Great there at Banyas. Many people say, well, isn't it Herod Philip who had a palace there? We go, yes, that's another palace. This is down at the bottom of the hill. This is one from Herod the Great. It's at the top of the hill. And so Raquel and I were able to analyze all these stones and put out several articles on it telling people that, hey guys, we found another Herodian palace.
Now, you're a mathematician.
Yes.
So how does mathematics, or being a mathematician, I know there are different levels, how does that tie into what you're doing? And also, I was wondering about your background. That is, what was it like growing up as a female who was a mathematician or with that those
Yes,
interests? So how did that lead to what you're doing?
I went to Virginia Tech and got my degree in mathematics. The year I started at Virginia Tech was the first year that women were able to enter tech in any career field other than home economics. So this was the year of females on campus. This was the beginning of co-ed Virginia Tech. There were always a limited number of women there, many who had started in home economics, other ones who had transferred in later on in their college careers. But this is the first year that we could start in a program that you wanted. So I started there in math, and we had lots of girls on my hall who were in sciences and engineering. It was all the science geeks who showed up.
That must have been fun. Yeah.
It was, because suddenly there was a school that we could go to. Prior to that, the programs were there, but we couldn't get in. And it was suddenly, hey, co-ed's allowed on campus. So I was able to work and get my degree in mathematics. And I did all different kind of jobs in the math field, a lot of teaching. My husband was in the Air Force, so we were moving constantly. So every place I went, I would get whatever job I could get, part-time, temporary, whatever, and usually try to get something in a math field.
When did your interest start in this subject? Was it all the way back in grammar school?
I always had an interest in geometry, in drawing geometric figures. And it turns out that one of the patterns that King Herod used, or it's like a pattern generator to generate some of his patterns, it turns out I was drawing that as my doodle when I was 5 and 6 years old. So when I finally realized what he was doing, I'm looking at this pattern going, wait a minute, I've been drawing that as my doodle since I was 5 or 6 years old, and realized it was his pattern generator.
That's wild.
Yeah, it was really wild when I figured that out. So it's like I was.
So it does relate. There's a relation there between geometry and what you eventually did.
Yes, because with these tiles, they were found out of context. And so they're just lying around, and you have a table full of tiles, and they're all different sizes and shapes. And based on the dimensions of them, you can only do several things with them in order to create a floor pattern. Herod had several, what do I call them, rules of how the floors are put together. And it had to do with one color tile is always put adjacent to a different color tile in the pattern. They were based on the Roman foot. You needed to be able to repeat the pattern to create an elegant pattern, things like that. And so there were limitations as to what you can do with the tiles, in order to match them up. There was only certain things that really worked according to the floors that Herod and Herod's masons had created. So it was kind of following his rules of how to make a floor that I was able to put these tiles back together again. But it helped that I knew the mathematics of what was going on. Many of the archaeologists, enjoyed doing their work, but they're not mathematicians. And so when it comes to something like this, they're willing to say, give this into a mathematician and let them.
Yeah. Who knew a mathematician would be such a value to archaeology?
Yes, they use biologists for the bones. They use people who are experts in glass. Of course, lots of people who are experts in pottery. And I always say, I was a mathematician they didn't realize they needed.
Right. Yeah. And what is your impression of, in general, the historicity of the Bible? And do you use that in any way to make discoveries?
Yes, I do. I do use the Bible. Um, what I say is the Bible is not a history book, but it contains many excellent historical facts within it. So you don't want to sit there and try to read it as I don't try to read it as a history book, but the fact that there's information in there that is historically accurate, and it's very, very useful. The other book that is very useful is Josephus, his Wars of the Jews, Antiquities of the Jews, because he was right there at the time, looking at the Temple Mount, looking at the buildings that Herod had built. And I've heard archaeologists say, yeah, if you're dealing with Herodian palaces, read Josephus, because he's going to give you very valuable information. So between the Bible and Josephus, you've got two ancient texts that give you very valuable historical information.
I know Josephus wrote pretty detailed descriptions. Didn't he have the
Yes.
temple? Yeah. Are
Yes,
there
he
any
did.
other descriptions in the Bible or any other information you gleaned from that?
You're given descriptions in the Bible of the first temple, but the text of the Bible was closed, or the text of the Hebrew Bible was closed prior to the time of the second temple. Mm-hmm. So we don't have historical information about King Herod's renovation of the temple. We don't have that. There are things in the New Testament, in the Christian New Testament, that give you some information. Some of the Gospels and in the book of Acts were given little pieces of information, little hints as to what was on the Temple Mount, because Jesus and his disciples were on the Temple Mount and they were walking in the portico of Solomon, or Paul is standing up on a platform over by the Antonia fortress. And so we're given verbal descriptions there in the New Testament, but not in the Hebrew Bible.
And you have your own history of coming to Judaism and your relationship with Judaism. Can you tell me something about that?
I was raised in the Catholic Church. My father was Polish Catholic. My mother claimed to be Polish Catholic, although I knew by background that her mother was Jewish and had been raised Jewish, and that line of our family was Jewish. I asked my mother when we were growing up, I don't know where, I'm not sure where I had heard the statement, someplace in the Catholic Church as a child. I mean, I was only 6 or 7 years old, that if your mother is Jewish, then you are Jewish too. And so I asked my mother, aren't we Jewish because Nana is Jewish, meaning her mother? And she says, no, well, Nana's not Jewish anymore, and I'm not Jewish, and you're not Jewish. Well, later on, I figured out what she meant was, Nana doesn't go to a synagogue anymore, and I don't go to a synagogue, and you don't go to a synagogue. It wasn't until much later that I realized there is a Jewish family line, and I indeed was Jewish and still am.
And were you always interested in biblical, were you interested in the Bible? Were you studying it in any way?
When I was young, when I was in the Catholic Church, at the time, the Catholic Church sort of had a tradition that you don't read the Bible. It is too hard to understand. We will tell you what you need to know. So I was raised with priests and the nuns in the schools who would give you a certain amount of information, but we didn't actually read the Bible. It wasn't until I left the Catholic Church in my late 20s and started attending a Protestant church that I found out there were people out there who actually read the Bible. And so I started reading it, first because it was a Christian group. We were reading the New Testament. And then I decided I should go back and read the Old Testament and see what's in there and find out why I was told that it was too hard to understand. So I went back and I started reading the Bible. And by the time I got through Genesis and Exodus, I'm going, what was I told all my life? Good grief. This is the history of my people. This is the history of the Jewish nation as you're reading through Genesis and Exodus. And that's when I got very, very interested in the Bible, because I realized it was my book. It's my history. Like I said, I don't read the entire book as a history book, but it's got lots of really good historical facts going through it. And it was in my late 20s, early 30s when I discovered the Bible. And I'd always been interested in archaeology, but didn't realize how much archaeology there was in Israel, because when you were going through junior high and high school, Israel was not a topic that was discussed in the American history program. You got development of Western civilization, you learned a little bit about Europe, and then you learned all about the United States, but you didn't learn about the history of Israel. And it wasn't until I started reading the Bible that I began to understand the history of Israel.
When I think of the temple or the Temple Mount, it seems like almost mythic. It's in all our prayers. It's mentioned all over Jewish tradition. So it's kind of hard to believe that it actually existed in a way. It seems more like a legend. But I know that you have led tours up on the Temple Mount. And
yes, I have.
I was curious about, you say that there are remnants of the first and second temple. So I wanted to hear about that because I didn't know about the first temple remnants. Plus, there is a bit of a dispute, isn't there, about where the first temple was? I know the city of David people believe it was in a different location.
No, the city of David people do not think it's in the city.
Oh, they don't. Okay.
That's other people. Yeah, they think it's in the city of David.
Yeah.
There has been enough archaeology done in, around, on, and under the Temple Mount to be able to pretty much say that the temple stood right at the spot where the Dome of the Rock stands today. In fact, the rock that is under the Dome of the Rock, for which it is named, when you look at it from above, you can see in it the impression of where walls would have stood for the Holy of Holies of the temple. And then in the very center, there is a rectangular area, a rectangular depression that was flattened out that is the size of the Ark of the Covenant. And you can see this in pictures taken from the Dome of the Rock.
On the rock, right.
Inside, on the rock itself.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I've been to the Temple Mount a few times, and it's very still. There's just a very strange energy there, I find.
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about it, but...
Well, first off, as a Jew, as a non-Muslim, there were only limited times we can go on the Temple Mount. It's about, let's see, during the winter months, it's 2.5 hours. And in the summer months, it's 3.5 hours in the morning, 1 hour in the afternoon, 5 days a week, Sunday through Thursday. It is not open on Fridays because that's the Muslim holy day. And that's when many of the Muslims are up there on top of the Temple Mount. And on Shabbat, it's not open for visitors to go up there. So you have 5 days a week that you can go, minus all Jewish holy days when it's usually closed, all Muslim holy days, most of the month of Ramadan. So there's probably only about half the year, really, you can even go up there. But again, very limited hours that a non-Muslim can go. It's open to Muslims 24/7, but not to non-Muslims. So even Christian groups are still stuck on this. Okay, you've only got, this little hour, this 3 hour block here and a 1 hour block here when you can make visits up there. Yeah. So just the technicalities of trying to get up there are difficult.
Yeah, it's gotten more and more difficult over the years, I think. My first memory in life is, people say you don't remember from when you're 2, but I remember. So at 2 years old, my father is carrying me through the old city of Jerusalem right after the capture of East Jerusalem to the wall, like immediately.
In 67, so,
yeah. So
amazing. Amazing.
I know. And I remembered it because I remembered like certain things, and I asked my father about when I checked it. I said, "Why did I remember this? Why did I remember that?" And it was all correct. Yes. So I know that you lead tours up there, and I was curious about the first temple remnants that you found up there.
There are 2 major places where you see remnants of the first temple. First is on the outside of the eastern wall. Where the eastern wall is, it has never moved farther east than where it was at the end of the Solomonic period, the end of the first temple period. King Herod expanded the Temple Mount to the north, to the west, and to the south, but not to the east. So when you walk along the eastern wall, there are some huge stones. They're bigger than the size of this table right here at the base of the Temple Mount. And those are some of the first temple stones from the retaining wall on the east side. Another place that you can see It's directly to the, it's to the northwest of the Dome of the Rock. There is what looks like a walkway that turns out it's not a walkway. It's actually the top of what was the western retaining wall of the Temple Mount during the Solomonic period, or for the first temple period.
The tunnels, I actually didn't take the tour when I was there last time, but I've seen video of 30-foot long rocks.
Okay, those are Herodian ones.
Yeah.
That's part of the western expansion.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that you see just to the northwest of the Dome of the Rock, these are up on the Temple Mount itself, because the Temple Mount then was expanded farther to the west. So when you're going along the Western Wall tunnel tours, you're following that newer wall. It's 2,000 years old. It's the newer wall out there. But
pretty
the older wall, you can
stones,
still see some of them. But if you don't know that that's what it is, there's no signs, no nothing that tells you. Someone has to know to tell you, excuse me, this right here, these are not paving stones. These are ashlars. This is the top of a huge building stone that was the western retaining wall of the Temple Mount at the time of the first temple that was there.
And what are the remnants of the second temple? Because I know they're actually pretty elaborate columns.
There are columns. There's so much there. I'm giving a program for my synagogue next week. We're taking our Pesach tour of the Temple Mount, and I'll be showing them all these different things that are part of the Temple Mount. And it actually, part of this derives out of a question that I saw on Jeopardy one day. The answer for the Jeopardy question was, this is the only remaining part of the second temple that is visible in Jerusalem today. So then the question, of course, was, what is the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall? And I thought, that is so wrong.
Yeah.
Because you have vast portions of the Northern Wall, the Southern Wall, the Eastern Wall, the Western Wall that are still there today, that are parts of the Herodian expansion to the Temple Mount and the Herodian Temple Mount. Also, there's entryways that come in from the south by the double gate and the triple gate. You actually cannot go in them now. They have been blocked, but they can be entered from the north side and go back down the stairs, although usually you're not allowed to do that because they take you into mosques, or what have been created as mosques, and so you're not allowed to go there. But if you see it on a video, or somebody got lucky and was able to go down in there, these entire hallways that are there with arches and domes in the top of it, these are all left from King Herod's time. This is King Herod's expansion of the Temple Mount. So all that underground structure is still there, and you can walk through it if you get permission, or if you're
right. I've never seen that.
Yeah, you can get down there. So there's huge sections that are still there. There's 4 gateways along the western side where you can see on the outside frames of doorways where the doorways went in. Of course, then like I said, on the southern side, you have the 2 sets of doorways, the double gate and the triple gate. You can still see where they were. You have all these stairs on the south side where people approach the Temple Mount, walking up all these stairs that are 2,000 years old.
Yeah, I actually visited the southern wall specifically last time I was there, and there were the stairs, of course.
Yes, all the stairs.
And then there's these stalls on this side, like
yes, they were shops. There are little stalls or remnants of stalls you can see along the southern wall, and then also along the western wall. In fact, under the Robinson's Arch area, there are 4 or 5 complete little shops that are still there, that are left over from the Second Temple period. And this is the place that people would sell any kind of goods, any kind of buying, selling, trading. But during the Hagim, like now, if people were going there for Pesach, they would not carry their lamb with them from the Galilee. Okay, they would sell their cattle, take the money, get down to Jerusalem, and then buy a lamb there. They would buy whatever they needed, and so these were being sold in these little shops also.
So I understand that you're also responsible for another very interesting find, which is the curse tablet.
Yes, the
And
Mount Ebal curse tablet.
yeah, so could you tell us about that and its significance? Because I know it has several different important
Okay,
aspects to the
I'll give
find.
you a little bit of information like that.
Okay.
That was found in a project conducted by the Associates for Biblical Research. It's a Christian group from the United States. I met them in 2008 when they were helping us at the Temple Mount Sifting project for a couple of weeks. And then starting in 2009, I began to volunteer on some of my days off. I would go out to their excavation. At the time, it was at Hirben and I worked with them there from 2009 until 2016. In 2017, we moved to Tel Shiloh. And we've been digging at Tel Shiloh, and I'll be going back to Tel Shiloh next month to dig with them again.
And where is that?
Shiloh is about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. It's on Route 60 going north. Well, it's Route 60 today, but it was the ancient Ridgetop Highway was what it was called. So it was about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. During December of 2019, this group got permission to sift through material that had been excavated out at Mount Ebal back in the 1980s. An archaeologist named Adam Zertal had found this site up there that he thought was an ancient altar, and he got permission to excavate there. And during his excavation, he found a rectangular altar. It's about 16 meters across. And as they went down into the center of the altar area, there was a rock wall all the way around it. As it went down through the fill in the center of it, they found a circular altar about 2 meters across. And he thought that this was the altar that is spoken about in Joshua chapter 8, that says Joshua built an altar there on Mount Ebal. Now, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are the two mountains where the Jews went shortly after they entered the Promised Land. 6 of the tribes were on Mount Ebal, 6 were on Mount Gerizim. The ones on Mount Gerizim would say, and if we do such and such and so, then God will bless us. And the people on Mount Ebal would say, amen. Then the people on Mount Ebal would say, and if we do such and such and so, God will curse us. And the people on Mount Gerizim would say, amen. So Mount Ebal got known as the Mountain of Curses. This is in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. But in Joshua 8, we're told that once the people got there, they went up and they had this covenant ratification ceremony there. This was the covenant that was given to them at Sinai before they entered the country. And now once they're in the Holy Land, they're ratifying their covenant there. And it says, and Joshua built an altar there on Mount Ebal. And Adam Zertal thought that this was the altar. The material that was found there dates back to that time to 1200 to 1400 BC. So being that at Tel Shiloh, we had this setup to do wet sifting, very similar to the wet sifting that was done at the Temple Mount Sifting project. Our director, Scott Stripling, asked the IAA, could we sift through the material that Adam Zertal put into his dump pile? He knew that the material from the excavation landed in 3 dump piles, but the material out of the square altar was in what's called the East Dump. And Antiquities Authority gave him permission to do that. So they collected a lot of the material from there, put it in these huge bags, put it on the back of trucks, and trucked it over to the nearest Jewish village where we had access to water so that we could wet sift this material.
Can you tell me something about that process? Wet sifting? Wet sifting. Is there anything to know about that process?
Okay. Most sites, you do something called dry sifting. You take a bucket of dirt, you pour it onto a tray. It's a big rectangular tray with a mesh screen at the bottom. You dump it on, shake it out, let all the powdery dirt fall through, and then you look through the material that's left on the top for pieces of pottery or for coins or for whatever you can find in it. But then there's an additional process where you take that material that's left on the top, move it to a different tray, and spray it with a garden hose. Okay. So that you're washing all the material so it's clean. Mm-hmm. And this is when you start finding lots of little things that you totally missed because they were encrusted with dirt before. Mm-hmm. And this was a process that was used at the Temple Mount Sifting project. And so lots of people in Israel know about it, and a lot of sites are using it now. So we were using it at Tel Shiloh. And so Scott Stripling decided, okay, let's take this process up to Mount Ebal and use that same process for going through that material and see if there's anything that Adams et al. Left behind. Mm-hmm. Adams et al. Actually did a wonderful job of getting diagnostic pottery out of there. There are very few pieces that had edges or rims that gave us dates. Mostly it was just the cast off, general pottery shards. We found a lot of little stone tools, flint knives, flint scrapers, and things like this. And then in one of my trays, I found a little lead tablet, that size, barely bigger than a postage stamp. When I first found it, it looked like it could be a pottery shard. It was that shape and that thickness. But I picked it up and it was very, very heavy, much too heavy to be a piece of pottery. And I knew it was lead. I had dealt with lead at other sites, so I knew how lead feels. It's so much heavier than a piece of pottery. It's probably 5 times heavier than a piece of pottery that size. So I washed it off, and I could see on it, we'll do it this way, I could see that it was folded over so that I could see a layer on the top, a fold, and a layer on the bottom. This is really hard to do backwards on the screen. Yeah. It was folded over to a very neat little rectangle. And I washed it off some more. I'm going, okay, it's lead and it's folded over, and this is the tablet. And I know that curse tablets are made out of lead. And here we are on the mountain of curses.
Yes.
So I called over to Scott Stripling and I said, hey, Scott, I've got something for you. I'm walking over towards him. And he goes, what have you got? And I put out my hand and go, a lead tablet. And of course, he was like, oh. Because he realized what it was too. We instantly realized that lead tablets usually have a curse written on them. And it turns out that this was indeed a curse tablet. But it took us 2 years before we could find out what was written in it. There was no way to pry it open. The metal was just, the lead was just too flaky.
Thousands of years old. Yeah.
It was a few thousand, a couple thousand years old there. Yeah. So it ended up being sent to an institute in Prague that had the ability to read through lead. They did scanning through lead, something called tomographic scanning. They were able to scan through it, and suddenly letters began appearing on the inside of it. And what showed up inside are 40 letters, and it's equivalent of 23 English words, and it is a curse tablet. And it has, cursed, 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 you will be cursed by God. And it was not like just by God, it was by God, El Yahweh. It was the ancient Hebrew name, the Yud He Vav, that was written in it. In fact, the Yud He Vav name of God is in there twice. And this is the oldest inscription that has been found in Israel, based on where it was found, the pottery in that area, where the lead is from. The lead is from a place in Lorion in Greece, which
interesting.
quit exporting this kind of lead around the 1200s. So we know it was part in the 1200s. So the material itself, and then the type of lettering. The lettering is not the ancient lettering like you see on Israeli coins. This is a previous type of Hebrew. They're calling it proto-alphabetic or proto-Hebrew script that is on there. So the kind of
same alphabet?
It's the same alphabet, but the figures are different. Yeah, the figures in it are different. But this alphabet is known from other inscriptions that have been found other places. So epigraphers know this kind of Hebrew, and they know that it is older than the Paleo Hebrew that we see on coins and in inscriptions. But it's the proto-Hebrew or proto-alphabetic Hebrew. Yeah.
Do they have a date on it? On the
it's going to be 1200 to 1400 BC, which is 32 to 3400 years old. It's old. Okay.
So it's dating. It's matching the history.
Matching the type of script, the source of the stone, and the pottery that was found in the same context, and everything dates to this 1200 to 1400 BC.
You said you found, I'm just curious because you said you found scrapers, stone scrapers, did you say? Stone
Yes,
tools?
we find pieces of flint.
Are
So you
those
use,
from that period or more ancient?
oh, a lot of them are from that time period. They can be more ancient than that, but
Mm-hmm.
they were mixed in, with the same material. And so we know it comes from the same time period based on the pottery and everything that's there. They're made out of flint. Flint is a stone that forms in between layers of chalk. And you'll get, the chalk is like chalk used for writing on a board. It's very soft, but the flint is very, very hard. When you break it, you get a very clean edge that can be sharpened, or it can be made into like a serrated blade for a knife. And
So it
this
was
was,
used past prehistoric times, like even up
yes, it was
into,
used in
yeah.
prehistoric times. It was used all during, I mean, these were the knives of the first temple period and most of the second temple period. Later on, you start getting, a bronze knife or something like that. But in the first temple period, a knife was a piece of flint. It was not what we think of as our kitchen knives of today. Not at all. It
Yeah.
was a stone. Yeah.
Can you tell me more about the kinds of stuff they found in the sifting project, the sort of big standout finds?
Which one? I have several. Okay.
Oh, there are several. Can you tell me all of them?
Okay. Well, I've worked with the sifting at the Temple Mount. I've worked with the sifting at all over Jerusalem. There at Emexorim National Park, where we had the setup, we did the material from the Temple Mount, but we also did material from excavations that were going on in the city of David, in the Ophel area, which is just south of the Temple Mount, all over, like in the Step Street project, or the Pilgrimage Road project, which
Right,
is
that's
all
underground,
material
right?
there. Yeah, we've excavated. I mean, we've sifted material from Tel Azekah, from Tel Lachish. And then I spent the 5 years with Tel Shiloh, sifting materials from Tel Shiloh. And then the 2 weeks we did the material from Mount Ebal. So I've worked with a huge variety of different sifting projects. And the primary reason for doing this is to find all the small things that got missed before. One of the things that we did at Tel Shiloh is we were sifting, both dry sifting and then wet sifting, all the material that we're bringing out of that site, which dates, oh my gosh, from the Bronze Age all the way up to the present. But we're going back and looking at the dumps of two prior digs that were done there. One was done by the Danish back in the 1920s and 1930s, and then they had one more season in the 1960s. And then another dig that was done by Israel Finkelstein and a group, a university group from there in Israel in the 1980s. And we went back into their dumps and we sifted their material that they had thrown away. They did not have the advantage of being able to use wet sifting at that time. And what we were finding was that for every glyptic piece of material or something that has writing on it, especially like seals that were used to document, for sealing documents, and bulai, which is the clay piece that's on the document, for the bulai and scarabs. For every bulai and scarab that they found, we found 4 more in the dump.
Oh, wow.
So we were finding
Wet sifting.
Wet sifting is the way to go on these digs. So we were finding 4 times as much material as they had. So they only recovered 20% of the material. But it's perfectly understandable because when it's all encrusted with dirt, especially with bulai, which is a lump of clay to start off with, it gets a little more dirt on it, and it's just a bigger lump of clay.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to find those items. But once you wet sift them, then you find so much more. And it was because of these results that we had at Tel Shiloh, of finding all these materials in the discarded material from the previous dumps, that Scott Stripling was interested in looking at the material from Mount Ebal. He thought, what if there's something left at Mount Ebal that got missed the first time around?
Yeah. What if?
What if? And
Yeah.
the if was a lucky if. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the Jerusalem sifting project, what kind of significant finds have been made?
In the material from the Temple Mount, we found, of course, coins going back to the very beginning of coins. We found some of the very early little tiny coins that had the owls on them. We found
owls, did you say?
Has a little tiny owl on it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
little tiny bird, right? Little
Yep.
owl. We found half shekel coins that were used for people to pay their temple tax. We found all these tiles that belonged to King Herod, a whole wide variety of things, all different kinds of ammunition, from arrowheads all the way up to modern bullets that were left over from the 67 war up there.
Yeah.
But then in the other projects from all of the city of David, we're finding, you name it, we found it along in these different projects. Some are made out of stone, so it's, flint tools, or carved stone vessels. In pottery, we find all different kinds of little pieces of pottery that got missed that have different kinds of inscriptions and things on them. So this wet sifting is a good way to find many of the little things that got missed during all the years of modern archaeology. There have been people who keep looking at Megiddo going, we need to go back and sift the dumps at Megiddo. Especially now that we found out.
My father did some work in Megiddo, actually.
Yeah.
In archaeology way back.
Yeah, they did not have the ability. They didn't have a water source, to be able to do all that, the wet sifting that requires water. They didn't have the ability to bring the water in to do it back then. And this is one place that would be very interesting to go back, because they did find a lot of scarabs, but not so many bullae. But any place you found scarabs, which you're using to make the seal, you should be finding the seals, but they get missed very easily. And if we were to go back there and sift, I think the biggest find there would be all the bullae, these document seals that got missed during the original excavation.
Okay, well, we're going to sum up, and I'm going to ask you, so the Temple Mount, this is just my question. This spot, this rock on the Temple Mount, this has probably been of significant for eons, is my feeling. Like there was some kind of altar there before Abraham. This goes all the way back. What do you feel about that spot, that incredibly controversial spot?
Each religious group around the world has its holy spot. That is the place that they use as their holy place, that is a connection to their God, to whatever, however they view God. And for the Jewish people, that is what this place is. It is this holy place of connection that gives us access to our God from right there. This is why Jews face Jerusalem when we pray. Wherever you are in the world, you face Jerusalem, because this is where your prayers are going to rise up to God. Not that God is up, but just metaphorically speaking.
Yeah.
For the Muslims, it is the third holiest place for Sunni Muslims. It's nothing to Shiite Muslims. It has no meaning at all to them. It's only for the Sunnis. And usually when people say, oh, it's the third holiest place in Islam, and you go, no, it's only for the Sunnis. It's not for the Shiite at all. They, they don't regard it as important at all. So for a certain portion of the Muslim population, they see that as a holy place for them. For Christians, it's holy because Jesus and his disciples were there. For Catholics, the holy place is the Vatican in Rome. Okay. But they still think of Israel as being the Holy Land because it was a place where Jesus lived. So you have that connection. But every religion has their holy spot. I mean, when I went up to Hatzor one day, we were standing in front of a building, and the tour guide was saying, oh, and this was the palace. And I'm going, no, it wasn't. This is the temple. He said, how do you know? I said, can't you feel it? He goes, what? I said, never mind. Won't go there. But it's like I could feel that was the holy place for whichever civilization was there, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. This was their holy place. When I've been to Sedona, Arizona, we get the same feeling there. This is the holy place for those people. Or Chaco Canyon. This is the holy place for those Native Americans that were in that spot. So each of these places is holy to the people, to a certain group of people. And for the Temple Mount, this is the Jews' holy spot.
Yeah.
This is their place of connection to their God.
I know they found wood when there was a earthquake and Al-Aqsa was damaged. They found wood beams that were
Yes, there were
dated.
beams that were found there, and a friend of mine, Paris Vervain, actually wrote an article for Biblical Archaeology Review about those beams, and some of the wood has tested to be close to 3,000 years old. So it's believed that some of that wood was actually brought down for the first temple, and then it was reused in the second temple, and was reused then.
Good
So
wood. You got to recycle, huh?
got to recycle that
Yeah.
wood. Yeah, but some of it has tested to be really close to 3,000 years old. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like
Yeah.
to add? I think we did a great exploration of this area.
Well, I would encourage people to visit Israel, to go and visit it for yourself and see. And when you go to all these different archaeological sites, places that have been excavated, it's just take a look around and see the quality of construction of what people did 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And you stop and realize that they knew a lot that we didn't know back then.
Yeah.
They were able to build these kind of buildings. They were able to leave these kind of homes that they have there. And we can learn a lot from them. And, these weren't people back in the Dark Ages. They knew a lot about construction. They knew a lot about surviving in that kind of climate. And they can teach us, we can learn a lot from them by the way that they led their lives many, many years ago.
Yes, much more advanced than we imagine.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me on your program. I've enjoyed doing this.